So we created 6 stories. They're about 10 to 15 minutes long. They covered a couple different thematics, a couple different sexual preferences to give an example of the range that we might offer. We put them on a Squarespace. So like literally didn't develop anything, did not take any kind of technical debt on. We just wanted to create something fast and easy and put those 6 MP3 files, literally it was that scrappy, on a Squarespace and sent it to 200 people that we knew. Friends, friends of friends, interested parties, you name it. And we saw that the next day, so 24 hours later, 1,200 people had been on the website. And that was really interesting. That was this really interesting little nugget fact that we could put on a slide and express to investors that even if these pieces weren't the best example possible of what we could make, that they gave them at least a sense of what we intended, helped to answer some questions of like, well, what do you really mean? And showed that people were at least curious and sharing it with their friends.
This is Female Founder World, and today's conversation is with Gina Gutierrez, the founder of Dipsea. Gina, welcome to the show. It's so great to have you. I love just to get everyone to introduce themselves and tell us about their company in their own words to get the episode going.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. So I'm Gina. I'm the president and chief creative of Dipsea. Dipsea is the first audio platform where storytelling intersects with sexual wellness. We had the insight a couple of years ago now that women of our generation were being handed a vibrator and being told this will solve everything in your sex life. And while it's a really important tool, it really discounts the fact that our minds are so, so important to our sex lives and to our own sense of sensuality and eroticism. And that content was a really missing kind of area focused on what women care to hear about. So interesting storylines, characters that connect, consent that sounds sexy. So our audio stories capture all of those details that we think get someone into that state of mind and help set the mood.
Are there any milestones that you can share to let people know kind of, where you are in the founder story and what stage the company is at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So we founded Dipsea at the beginning of 2018. We raised a seed round in 2018. We recently closed a Series A in April of this year. And so we've raised about 13.4 million to date. We've used that to build a team of 25. We're about half production and story creation and half product. So I run the story studio and my co-founder, Faye, is building the platforms, managing our engineers, and kind of guiding the financial future of the business.
Amazing. And what was your background before you came to Dipsea? What were you doing professionally?
You mean, was I making erotic stories before I started Dipsea? So I think one of the funniest things about starting Dipsea is that when you're entering a space that no one's ever played in before, there aren't actually expectations of who the ideal founder is, which is great from a fundraising perspective. What's less great is convincing investors that you know how to do and make what you're talking about. And so my background was in brand strategy. My co-founder's background was in finance and as a software engineer. So we could convince investors that we were an ideal team for thinking about building an amazing consumer product and that we were, going to have a technical founder that could actually build that experience, which was really compelling. What we were less able to prove was that we could make compelling erotic audio. And, there was no one that was really doing so. So that was such an interesting part of the journey, was being in Faye's kitchen, before we had an office, before we had a team, unplugging her fridge because it was making too much noise. I was acting as director. She was acting as sound engineer to make a couple stories, because really all you have to prove is what you can make yourself. That is like the true scrappiness of a startup. So our backgrounds, I think, suited us well for building an amazing brand and building an amazing app. They did not suit us well necessarily for being audio producers. So we made enough to show and give people an understanding of what we meant by this kind of out there idea. And then we're able to build a team that is much better at doing that than we are.
Could you just dig a little bit more into what your MVP looked like and how you proved traction before you went out and raised that seed round?
Yeah, so our alpha essentially looked like, well, maybe I'll take a step back and say our core content, the main thing that people are listening to, are short format erotic audio pieces. They're multi-actor. They are these immersive little soundscapes. It's like you're dropped into a world. And while we record actors asynchronously, we mix those together so it sounds like people are together, and it creates this really interesting, almost like new wave radio drama, right? And so what we needed to prove was what that actually sounded like, because I can describe that to you now and you can still not totally know what I'm talking about, right? So we knew that we needed to create a couple of those pieces at least to express what it actually would feel like and that it could be compelling. So those are kind of the two pieces. Is it subjectively and qualitatively good? And the second was, would people be interested in it? And that's what we felt we needed to prove. So that's how we defined our alpha. So we created 6 stories. They're about 10 to 15 minutes long. They covered a couple different thematics, a couple different sexual preferences. To give an example of the range that we might offer, we put them on a Squarespace. So like literally didn't develop anything, did not take any kind of technical debt on. We just wanted to create something fast and easy and put those 6 MP3 files, literally it was that scrappy, on a Squarespace and sent it to 200 people that we knew. Friends, friends of friends, interested parties, you name it. And we saw that the next day, so 24 hours later, 1,200 people had been on the website. And that was really interesting. That was this really interesting little nugget fact that we could put on a slide and express to investors that even if these pieces weren't the best example possible of what we could make, that they gave them at least a sense of what we intended, helped to answer some questions of like, well, what do you really mean? And showed that people were at least curious and sharing it with their friends.
I love hearing those stories about how an MVP actually pans out and what it tactically looks like and the really tangible details about it, because I do feel like people understand that they're meant to be scrappy in the beginning and find the easiest possible way to prove out their idea, but it's not always, actually putting that into action can feel a little bit more complicated. So once you went out with your seed round, you had a little bit of money to really grow the idea and turn it into something meaningful. What were the next steps in building out a more robust business and a more robust kind of technical offering behind it?
Yeah, so what you probably would get told by the generation prior. So for example, my dad's an entrepreneur and he was like, you have to build a business plan. And I was like, I don't think people do that anymore. And he was like, what do you mean? You need a binder full of pages that explain exactly what you're going to do. And it's, I'm teasing my dad, but what he intended is actually still very true in that you kind of need to state your strategy and state your goals and what you think you can achieve. It no longer needs to be laminated and in a binder, but it's definitely like really helpful, especially if you have a co-founder or multiple co-founders. Just make sure you have all on paper or in a Google Doc what you are trying to achieve here and what you think you need to hit in order to see success. And how you want to define, the monetization of your business is also really important to state up front. I think that's an easy trap in startup land where it's like, all you really need to do is raise money. You don't need to make money. There's many different paths that you can take there. Are you proving growth? Are you proving early traction towards, being profitable? Like, what are you trying to achieve here and what do you need to do? And so that was really the first step, was Faye and I getting on the same page. And one of those things was that we felt really strongly that in this space that was loaded with a ton of taboo, a lot of poor expectations about quality, that we needed to own the experience in its entirety. We needed to make an amazing app experience that felt beautiful and that felt premium. And we needed our stories to feel really safe and sex positive, but also, of course, sexy. And we had these really lofty ideas about what that ideal experience was. And we felt like we were the ones to build that. So what that basically meant was we were going to be a mobile subscription business. We wanted to build an app. We didn't want our content to just live on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or all these other places, because it didn't allow us to create the safety of that experience. And it didn't allow us to create an understanding or a sharp kind of data set of what people were interested in so we could make better content. And so that was kind of one of the first things that we decided together, was kind of the model of how we were going to build the business. And it's interesting because you kind of have to decide and understand up front, how are you're going to solve the biggest challenges that are going to confront you based on the business that you choose, right? So in our world, we were going to make all of our content. We were going to be original content producers. That means the first couple of months, first couple of years even, can be really hard because you're basically producing enough content that you can keep people around, right? We weren't taking on a licensing model like Netflix, saying like, hey, you watch a ton of Friends content, you can watch Seinfeld here, while we work ourselves up to making our own content. We didn't take that path. And so we knew we needed to make a lot in order to get the people who liked what we were making to have enough to stay. That was really our challenge. And so it's interesting to kind of map out the future ahead of you and what you need to do to achieve that. And for us, it was making a lot of content, which meant that's where we focused our hires.
In the early days, I mean, I first came across Dipsea on Instagram. I think someone shared maybe when you guys first raised, or I came across an ad. I'm not sure, but I remember looking at it and thinking, "Oh my God, this is just such a great idea. I can't believe that something like this hasn't existed before." How were you guys getting your first users in the early days, and how has that changed now?
Yeah, great question. So in our space, there was no space before Dipsea, right? And so that's a negative in a lot of ways because it means you're teaching people what you're talking about. You're giving people new language they've never heard before. You're asking people to compare you to things that maybe aren't the perfect references, like headspace, right? Like early press often called us a sexier headspace, which isn't necessarily a bad description. It's just, it shows people's desire to compare you to something that they already know and understand. And so that's the kind of challenge of it. The exciting part of it is that people want to talk about you because it's this radically new thing. And so in the beginning, we were really lucky that we got some pretty incredible press talking about this idea of what women deserve and what they really haven't gotten before. And these kind of core ideas about sexuality being a mind first experience and how content can really play into that, and how you can listen to something that's fundamentally erotic and still really learn from it, how you might ask for something in bed with your own partner, or what boundaries you might want to set in your own life. And so there's a lot to talk about. We got a lot of press pickup. We got, Marie Claire articles, Elle articles. We eventually got a New Yorker piece and a New York Times piece. And those were huge for us. Those were enormous, enormous moments of growth for us. Over time, it's less, new. And so you have to look for new avenues to grow. And so that's when we started building a more robust plan around how we were going to do paid advertising. And one of the ways that I think is maybe more interesting to talk about than kind of the classic, we advertise on Facebook and Instagram, which is true. Most people targeting Gen Z or millennial women are on those platforms, is also podcasting. We're asking people to listen to our content. And so people listening to podcasts theoretically are already primed to want to do that. They're audiophiles. And so it was really fun to start hearing podcast hosts talking about our product and how it affected them. And really, what's more compelling than someone that you already know and love and follow because they're talking about interesting things, saying, "Hey, I tried this new thing and here's how it affected me and here's why I love it." And that's worked really, really well for us.
I was really curious when I first kind of dug into what you're doing. Are you regulated in a similar way to the adult entertainment industry as a whole? Are there any kind of specific things that you need to be considering if you want to create a business in this space?
Absolutely. It's really, really interesting to see that a lot of policies built by regulators, by platforms like Google and Facebook, by financial institutions are very, very outdated, and that they don't understand that there is nuance in the space of sexuality. And what I mean to say is it's very, very interesting, like easy, I suppose is the word. It's very easy to say anything that relates to sex should be in the same no-no category as drugs, guns, alcohol, all sorts of vice categories, right? And, it's such a sadness, I think, that that's the way that we've relegated sex, when really you can say, actually paying attention to your sexuality, you should be attending to that the same way that you drink water and exercise and meditate, right? Like this is actually a very, very core part of wellness. And, big institutions like the World Health Organization agrees, right? Like in their actual understanding and description of positive sexuality, they talk about pleasure as a part of that experience. The WHO is doing that, right? So there are very different understandings in the space about what is good and what is okay. I'm like air quoting right now. You can't see me. That isn't shared. And so that's really tricky for a sexual wellness business to navigate, right? Like who is pro, who is con, what can you do, what can't you do? It's not clearly outlined. And I think that's the kind of fundamental challenge of the space is there really aren't clear cut like yeses and nos. It's really, I'll know it when I see it, right? And so platforms like Apple will say, yeah, I will know when I see something that I think should not be on our platform. But then who are you leaving that decision to? Are you leaving it to the random, person that's been hired to skim a bunch of ads and say, "Oh, that word sexy seems inappropriate, I'm going to flag it"? It really creates a lot of challenge because nuance isn't being accounted for at all. And so Faye and I have had a really interesting time, Faye's my co-founder, reaching out to these platforms when we've had hiccups and being like, "Hey, we are two female founders trying to do a fundamentally good thing for women," right? Like we're taking on a really important feminist task here. And we're explaining to people how sexuality can be so beneficial and all these things. And there's actually openness once you get someone's ear. Getting someone's ear is the hard part, right? So I think more and more as people enter the space kind of behind us, there have been people ahead of us too, right? There are founders ahead of us in this space that did some pioneering, and we're doing some pioneering. And I think that there's growing understanding that these policies aren't doing a good enough job of allowing for the fact that there are good actors making good content who care about their users. And then, of course, there are bad actors as well. And there needs to be a better job of sorting between them. And that's a reckoning that I think a lot of big platforms are coming to terms with right now.
Okay, so when you talk about the outreach with platforms, are you proactively reaching out to the platforms? Like, for example, when you brought on a payment provider, did you go to them and say, this is the type of content we're producing, this is why it's meaningful and important, does it meet your guidelines? Or has it been more of a forgiveness and not permission type scenario?
Yeah, we were definitely asking for forgiveness, not permission, because we knew that people needed to see it to understand it, right? The same way that we knew investors needed to hear it to understand it. And so we weren't alerting people to our presence until they indicated to us, hey, we're not so sure about this. And then we launched into an opportunity to say, all right, let's meet, let's talk, let's be people to each other. That's not always easy. Like Faye and I live in the Bay Area. We have the privilege of being able to drive down to Google's campus and ask for an audience, which we did. One day, maybe a year and a half ago, Faye and I showed up at Google wearing matching turtlenecks accidentally, being like, hello, can someone please give us an audience? And ultimately we got one.
Good for you.
Ultimately we got one, which was pretty incredible. And we got to give a presentation to a few, policy deciders at the organization. And we're like, hey, how are you allowing apps that are so clearly misogynist and, really, really damaging to women? How do you allow apps like that to exist and not ours? And they admitted and acknowledged they didn't have good answers, right? And so we have been definitely proactive once we've gotten pushback, but we haven't necessarily been like, hey, we want to alert you that we exist. Once you reach a size and scale that people are paying attention to, that's something to celebrate in its own way.
I want to shift gears a little bit and kind of dig into what your days look like, what your responsibilities look like at the moment. I know that you mentioned before that your co-founder, Faye, is very much looking after the tech and the finance piece while you're focused on production. What does that mean in a company of your size?
Yeah, so as chief creative, I'm basically overseeing how we tell our stories, right? Like we are a story studio. So production is part of a story's journey, but editorial is also part of a journey. So we have writers on staff, we have editors on staff, we have audio producers who act as directors in studio with hundreds of voice actors that we work with remotely all over the country, and who also mix stories together to create these immersive sound environments, and sound designers who are ultimately creating the effects that make it feel like you're really there. So it's a whole mix of people that a story is getting passed to. And we sometimes talk about it like this glass orb. You're like passing this glass orb from person to person and being like, don't break it, be careful, because there's so many moments in any creative process where you can really lose that magic, and you really need to preserve that magic. And especially so with something that's erotic, right? Because it's so easy to get the ick when you miss the nuance of how one character responds to the next, or you use the wrong word, or a sound is a little too much. It's very easy to create cringe. And so we're very, very careful about making sure we pass that glass orb on from person to person and create these pieces that are really, really, really considered and careful in their final output. So I oversee the team that does that work. I help to figure out what kinds of stories we should be telling, what kinds of new formats we should be experimenting with, how we should be partnering with the product team to surface content differently, right? The same way that we all understand as users of Netflix. You can have amazing content on Netflix, but never ever find it, right? And that's a terrible user experience. And so those things matter in any sort of content world. So partnership between product and content is really paramount there as well. And then I'm doing a lot of work on the brand. What does it look like? What does it feel like? How are we talking about ourselves in ads? How are we talking about ourselves in public spaces? What are the ways that we can push it forward? What are the ways we can talk about it in press? All of that kind of falls in my world too. And, it's funny because it's like a layer of storytelling on a layer of storytelling, right? It's basically my job.
Could you please just help people understand How are you getting all of this done? It sounds like you're managing a really big team. Plus, I imagine you're reporting to external stakeholders and investors as well. What kind of things are you doing within your day to really maximize your efficiency and be most effective within the business? And then when you finish work, how are you kind of building in that boundary to really separate who you are as a co-founder and a chief creative officer versus who you are at home and in your personal life?
I think I'd start at the very, very ground floor, which is as a team, Dipsea is very, very sharp about our values, how we hire people, who we bring on, what qualities we're looking for in folks. And so accountability and ownership are really, really big parts of what we're looking for. People who aren't just like, oh, I solved the task at hand. It's like, oh, I'm addressing a bigger problem. And that's part of this brand value that we basically call we're all in this together. So like our version of excellence is making sure that your excellence is not just getting amazing results. It's also lightening the load for your peers. It's making sure that you're there to help them. It's making sure that when you take your vacation, when you want to take it, you're not leaving someone else with a load to deal with, right? Like that's really how we frame our work. It's like ultimately take 100% responsibility. And so I think that really creates this great dynamic where, you know, in a meeting, if we're showing up and there isn't an owner and there isn't an agenda, we shouldn't have that meeting. Hey, let's meet in a week when we're better prepared, right? Let's use our time wisely. And we talk about that a lot as a team. You know, if there's 6 people in a meeting, that's not 1 hour of time. That's 6 hours of time. That's a very, very valuable meeting. So let's like really make sure it is used wisely. So those are some of the ways that we make sure that we're not just doing things to do them. And then another thing I say is, you know, if someone presents me a plan, a strategy, a document, and I'm asking them like, well, why do you think we should do this? And it's more of like I think we should, without a compelling, I really believe this is going to move the needle in this way, or I think this is important to address proactively, or you name it, whatever the goal is. I have to say, you know, we really need the why before we go into the what or the how, always. That's kind of a mandate. And that can, I'm sure, annoy my team, right? That I'm always asking, like, what are the objectives up front? But I think it really helps to grease the wheels. We're like, I know what I'm looking at. I understand that there is kind of pre-thought put into what I'm responding to or reviewing. And it makes everyone feel like we're kind of on the same page. So those are some of the ways that I think in a day we are using time thoughtfully. And then your second question was, could you repeat it for me? How do I like kind of maintain a boundary between work and life?
Yeah. And so, you know, I think part of that is making sure that you're, you know, being more efficient during your days also, I think allows you to create those boundaries in a better way. But what are you doing? Like, do you have any routine, ritual, something that kind of helps you create that boundary between your life as a founder and a tech entrepreneur and your life outside of work?
Yeah, I think this is a much harder question to answer coming out of the COVID era because it kind of disrupted so much of routine. And now we have to figure out a whole new routine. But I'd say generally speaking, making sure that I'm prioritizing time to be in yoga every week matters so much to me. It is so important to move my body and remember that I'm a human being with a body and not just a brain that sits at a desk is so huge. I have been doing a coaching group that encourages us every day to meditate for 10 minutes, which sounds easy, is so hard to find 10 minutes every day to do it. I've been doing it at lunch and it's been such a helpful reset to remember, even if my brain feels clear, my body's actually buzzing, right? Like I'm pretty frantic right now and breathing really, really helps slow that down. So that's been kind of an unexpected gift because I was like, oh my God, how am I going to do that every day? Another thing that I'd say is reminding yourself that how you kind of talk in a business world isn't necessarily how you want to talk all the time and snapping into that. So when I get a call from my parents or a call from my partner, we're not talking to each other like we need to get some tasks accomplished. We slow down, you know, we can say, how was your day? We can have a little bit more of like it's really easy, I think, at, 6:30 p.m. when I go into my partner's office and I'm like, how was your day? And he's like, oh, it was good. Here's what I accomplished. And I'm like, it's me. Like we can be different with each other. And sometimes that's hard when it's all happening in your house. So it's been nice to have a couple days a week to be back at a coffee shop or back in an office. I think that's been really helpful too. Just containers matter so much.
And Gina, the last thing that I ask everyone who comes on the show is to share a resource recommendation. It could be a book, a podcast, a community that you're part of, something that's helped you to grow Dipsea and grow as a founder as well.
Oh, that's a great question. I think that my biggest answer here isn't necessarily a specific resource, but like a kind of call to action, which is the entrepreneurial journey can feel so lonely, like especially if you are a founder, especially if you're a solo founder. If you're a solo founder listening to this, I'm so like power to you. That is so hard. And I think it's really, really important to remember early to make time to meet other people having similar experiences to you, because while it can feel really fluffy, like it's not actually helping what you need to accomplish that day or that week or that month, it will be so invaluable to have a peer network to go to, not even to ask questions about what you should do next, because you definitely will have those moments, but also to admit and acknowledge that things are hard and that you don't know what to do next. And so I think it can be really easy to prioritize the immediate, right in front of you, get it done, and ignore those relationships. And I highly recommend thinking about those as like the most important investment you could make.
That's great advice. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Gina, and congratulations on all of the success with Dipsea so far.
Thank you so much. So nice to be here.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning into this episode of Female Founder World. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, please don't forget to leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts.